Hi, everyone. Really excited to be here. I'm Mary Johnson, and I am the founder and chief content creator for Brave New Word. And this is a really perfect and interesting discussion. Perfect in that I hang out in this space of differentiating brands all the time, but fascinating because we're going to really talk about it in a much different way than I'm used to. I hang out in the marketing space a lot, and really, when it comes to differentiating your brand in the digital era, it's about so much more than that. So, very happy to welcome Scott Albahary of Perficient. Scott is the chief strategist in financial services for Perficient, and has a ton of really fantastic experience in digital, but also on the client side and working on client centricity. So yeah, I'm going to go ahead and dig in right away, Scott, if that works for you.
That's great. Thank you, Mary. It's great to be here.
Awesome. What is the main digital strategy challenge financial institutions are facing today?
Well, I think the main challenge is really one of what you just mentioned a few moments ago, brand differentiation, right? How do financial institutions use the technology to differentiate themselves in the marketplace and actually get a competitive advantage? If you look at the history of what we used to talk about in financial services from a digital transformation point of view, it was all about how do I enable my transactions on the web? How do I enable my transactions on a mobile application? How can I make myself more relevant to younger generations, Gen Z and millennials? How can I re-architect my organization so that we're more agile? All those types of things that were really foundational. And for the most part, the industry has been very successful at doing that. And now we're really entering a phase of what I would call post-digital transformation, meaning we've transformed. It's become a way of doing business. And so now really the industry is looking for ways to use the technology to optimize their investments and to become, like you said, more differentiated, more competitive, because the competitive threats are now coming from both outside the industry as well as within the industry.
That's so interesting. And I have to say, I mean, I have my personal bank. I've quite literally never walked into a branch. It's, that's never been an experience I've had with my business bank. I set it up in person, but then have never spoken to anyone ever since. It's been entirely mobile and digital. So it's really fascinating. And that ease of use has got to be paramount. But so please go ahead.
I'm sorry, and that's really a huge paradigm shift for banks, for example, right? Banking used to be something that you went to. I went to the bank, I go to the bank, I do my transactions. Now banking is something you do on your phone. And that's, like you said, people can have a very close and beneficial and profitable relationship with a bank just by using their phone. And so that drives you to a whole different set of capabilities when you talk about how do I differentiate my brand using technology?
Right. So what are the challenges to differentiating your brand for a financial institution?
Well, the challenges are many, right? And I think it stems from the fact that banks have to think, and most financial institutions have to think in a much different way, because banking is now something you do on your phone as opposed to someplace you go. So it's become almost table stakes, right? Everybody knows how to send money to their friends with Zelle. Everybody knows how to make deposits, taking a picture on your phone. Everybody knows how to transfer money. Now it becomes a question of how do I, as a financial institution, become more intertwined with my customer's life? How can I be more relevant to them in the context of their everyday life? And there are ways to do that. And it goes way beyond just, I can easily transfer money from one account to another on my phone.
Interesting. So talk to me about that a little bit. And I think historically speaking, it's always been about relationships with banks. I have a great relationship with my contact at the bank. Or I remember even at the start of the pandemic when the PPP loans were first coming out and everyone was in this mad dash to get them. I remember having this conversation with my dad, and he asked me if I had a good relationship with my bank, and I said, I have nobody. Is this going to hurt me? How am I going to ever make it through this mountain of people applying? So tell me about some of those things. Without having that person you have that relationship with at the bank, what are some of the ways financial institutions can enhance their brands?
Well, and I wouldn't go so far as to say that the ideal is not to have a relationship with somebody at the bank, but the ideal is to bridge that physical and digital space so that you have the right relationship and that you're talking to folks at the bank or at your financial institution for the more complex and relationship building type activities and not for the general everyday transactional activities. And that has been a challenge for the banks to kind of figure out. There's a lot of experimentation going around. There's no lack of effort, right? JP Morgan Chase is actually expanding the number of branches in major metropolitan areas. Other banks are closing branches. You have some banks like Capital One instituting cafe type branches. So everyone's trying to figure out what's the right relationship to have. How do I allocate my resources in the digital world and also in the physical world to make that relationship appropriate? And there's a lot of experimentation going around. I'm not sure at this point who's going to win and what's going to win out. So, I think the message is experiment aggressively and implement selectively.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I'm really fascinated at that combination of things. The digital experience has to be paramount, but then you also have to have this in-person experience as well for if and when people want it. And the concept of the cafe type bank is really interesting. And I think you had sent some statistics over prior to our conversation today, and one of them was the fact that COVID obviously drove customers and financial institutions to rely more heavily on digital channels. But 73% of customers have tried new shopping behaviors since COVID-19, and that's where the opportunities are. And so, so what are some of those opportunities or tactical gaps maybe that have been highlighted by COVID that financial institutions are leaning into now?
Well, COVID accelerated a lot of things that banks were already working on, and it made the banks realize, oh my gosh, we have to do things a lot faster. I think from a tactical point of view, although the banks and financial institutions have done a lot in terms of digitizing everyday transactions and making that as seamless and as frictionless as possible, excuse me, there's still a lot of friction in that space that can be worked on. There's instances where banks allow you to open an account online, but you still have to go into a branch to sign paperwork. Appointment setting, I think, was one of those things that was really highlighted as a weakness. My bank, for example, if you wanted, they, like all other banks, all the branches in the area closed down. And if you wanted to go do something at the bank, you had to make an appointment. Well, the appointment setting capability on the website and on the mobile app was very kludgy and clunky. You would pick a day and a time, and you would pick a branch, and then it would tell you if somebody was available. And this is a bank that has branches within 10 minutes of each other. It wouldn't give you an alternate branch. It wouldn't give you an alternate time. It wouldn't allow you to make any selections. And if that didn't work out for you, you had to start the process all over again. So it's a question of what do people expect versus what do they get? And if you think about it, if you think about Open Table, for example, that's what people expect when they're making appointments. Like, it's easy to change. I can pick different times. I can change the amount of people. I can change the location. And that's not what they're getting from a lot of the financial institutions today. So from a tactical point of view, there's still work to be done in terms of making those experiences as seamless and as frictionless as some other industries like retail has done, for example.
And what about from a strategic perspective? What are some strategic areas that financial institutions should be looking to enhance their brands?
Well, we do a lot of work for companies outside of the financial services industry. And we've done a lot of work that we believe is very transferable into the financial services industry, especially in the idea of increasing brand loyalty, increasing digital adoption, making those experiences even more frictionless, even better experiences than what people get today. So, for example, we've worked with one of the largest global athletic apparel manufacturers, and I don't want to mention who they are, but you can probably guess. But
so, an idea.
So we help them develop a strategy and select and implement an omni-channel capability, an omni-channel platform that allowed them to bring together all their different communication channels, and then add to that other channels like social media, Facebook, and voice, all without building new infrastructure. And really, the benefit there is somebody can go and they can shop for a pair of sneakers, and if they have questions, they can then talk to somebody through the mobile app on a chat kind of device or through voice, and talk to somebody and get some advice in terms of which sneaker is best for their particular needs and what kind of exercise they want to do and that type of stuff. They can also talk to customer service folks, and there's also a community of customers that they can go and ask questions and give advice to and things like that. So that's a way of developing a community around a brand and bringing people into the brand and making that brand part of their everyday life. And that's things that we think are very transferable into the financial services industry. I mean, the concept is the same. I have a question about a product. It's a complicated product and service, and I want to pick the right one for my particular needs, and I want to get advice, and then I want to be able to complete that transaction without having to do anything else and go to another channel.
Interesting. And it's so true. I mean, and you mentioned it. You mentioned it also when we were talking about this earlier. But I feel like that helps you stay digital, but also bring in a human element to your brand. Because I think traditionally, when you think about digital communications with clients, you think, or at least I do anyway, I think of chatbots on a website, which are rarely, well, I don't know if I'll say that, rarely helpful, but I've had hit and miss experiences with it. But this sounds like it's taking it to a much different level, and it really is bringing in that a human connection to the experience that you're having with any company, really.
Absolutely, and that's a challenge, right? The challenge is to understand your different customers, your customer segments, the personas, as we call them in the business, right? And to understand their journey in terms of making a purchase, or their journey in terms of getting some service, and when is it appropriate. The worst thing is to bombard folks with inappropriate technology, and I think that turns people off more than generates customer loyalty. I think the days of just trying to figure out how can I lower my cost as much as possible by deflecting everything into an automated type of system are long past. It's a much more nuanced and complex type of solution that you need to think through in order to apply the appropriate technology at the appropriate time. And that's the challenge, right? That's the challenge. And that requires a lot of infrastructure and a lot of thought from a strategic point of view on how to execute on that strategy.
Interesting. I feel like that's still unexpected to a degree, but when you think about the amount of technological investment that has to happen to really create good experiences for your customers, or even internally for your team, I mean, and I'm sure, and companies everywhere had to experience that last year in the rush to digitize and help a workforce go remote. You had to invest in Zoom, which is not all that expensive, but right. You had to invest in all these other applications and platforms to streamline communication, and it's not easy.
No, it's not. And they're in the financial services business. You have a lot of regulations. You have privacy regulations. So there's a lot of things that you have to take into account. There's a lot of risk that you have to manage as a financial institution, because if you do it wrong and you have a data breach, for example, that's a lot more costly to your reputation, to your firm, than any benefit you might get from being able to deflect calls or deflect transactions into a digital channel.
Right. So You had just talked about how a lot of the strategies that are taking shape in other industries can apply to financial institutions. But there's also some threats out there for financial institutions that apply some strategies that others have made very successful. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I think, right now we're all focused on things like artificial intelligence, conversational marketing, right? The bots that are actually intelligent and that you can actually have a conversation with that don't frustrate you, those types of things.
Mm.
And that's great. I think that there's also a level of trying to figure out what's the right level of investment that I, as a financial institution, need to make in those types of technologies. I can't tell you how many times I've been in meetings with customers and they say, well, we want to be like Amazon. And that's not necessarily the right answer for every single organization out there.
Mm.
So I think one of the things is to really understand, from a financial institution point of view, what your competitive advantages are, where you play in the marketplace, and whether the investments you need to make in order to stay current with, what's not necessarily the best in class, but at least close to the best in class in a number of different areas, what effect that'll have on earnings and stock price and the things that really matter. Because it's not, at the end of the day, it's not about making a better customer experience, it's about making a better business.
Mm.
And, the financial services industry faces some threats, both, the mid-size and smaller banks face threats from the bigger banks. A bigger bank can come into your market space and not open a branch and take away market share just based on its app and its mobile website. They're also facing threats from technology companies in the sense that, Amazon says they want to open checking account services, and that's like the rest of the industry catches cold, and so there's a lot of fear out there that some of these larger companies can start to take over banking functions and other financial institution functions. So the question is, I think history shows you that if you have the right partnerships and the right business model, you can be very successful. So maybe you don't have to be like Amazon, but maybe you can be sort of a back end wholesale type of financial institution, and you can process transactions for other partners who actually control the technology and the user experience portion of it. Maybe that's the right way to go. Maybe you want to control the user experience portion of it and be more end to end. Whatever strategy you choose is really going to have a profound effect on the types of technology investments you make and the capabilities that you mature as an organization. So those are the things that from our perspective, we talk a lot about. What kind of a bank do you want to be?
Yeah.
What makes sense? What does it mean to you? To what does digital technology, tech transformation mean to you? Those are simple questions, but as you talk about them, they can become very complex answers. And the more you think through those, the better off, the more focused you'll be on in terms of the types of investments you need to make.
Interesting. So on the topic of other industries, what lessons or best practices should financial institutions or banks take away from changes or improvements that happened over the last 12 to 15 months, sort of in that, that frenetic COVID period of time?
Well, I think the first lesson learned is you don't have to be perfect, right? You mentioned PPP loans earlier.
Yes.
There was a lot of what I would call Wizard of Oz stuff going on, meaning there was a lot of frantic activity behind the curtain that nobody saw, no customer saw, but people were up 24 hours a day entering PPP loan data into terminals. So you don't have to be perfect. And people were very appreciative of the effort that banks made in that space. And I think the other thing to take away is that, the technologies that revolve around conversational marketing and personalization are going to be very important for financial institutions going forward. And then based on that, you have to decide how high on that maturity level do I want to go, and what makes sense for my particular market space, my particular sized company, et cetera, and then look at appropriate partnerships where appropriate, And again, that strategy will drive the types of technologies that you need.
Interesting. So another statistic that you shared with me was the fact that as of 2020, financial institutions reported 85% of their digital experience didn't meet the needs of their customers. So what are these organizations missing to fill the customer experience gap?
I think in one word, it's data. And it's not a lack of data. The financial services industry is so data intensive. There's more data floating around than is really needed in order to enhance your brand and enhance your relationship with your customers. But it's all in different places. It's all in different older systems. It's the ability to kind of orchestrate it, ingest it, analyze it, and then deliver it when and where needed. Used to be, it was okay to deliver data overnight. You come in the next day, you'd have your reports or whatever. Now we're talking, you need real-time capabilities, because when someone comes in on the mobile app and they want to do a transaction, you have to do some analysis and then, give an offer or a coupon or a suggestion that's based on that particular customer's history. That's a very different data infrastructure that exists in most financial institutions today. So there's an infrastructure and tools component, and there's also a skills component, in the sense that those skills, meaning data scientists and the folks who can really look at data and analyze it in a way that makes sense in this environment, they're in short supply. And so, those are some of the challenges that financial institutions face today.
And they're significant.
They are.
Yeah.
And there has to be, Jeff Bezos came out with a memo in 2002. And basically he said to his teams, if you don't share data amongst yourselves, you will be fired. I mean, that was the gist of it. And that was the foundation for a lot of the stuff that you see today, like Alexa and AWS. But the idea that the different groups within Amazon would share data through standardized interfaces to make it easier is one of the foundational aspects of their phenomenal success. And that is something that financial institutions are moving towards, but they are not as high on that maturity scale as some of the tech companies are. Right. And there's a lot of reasons for that. It's not for a lack of motivation. It's just that the fact that there's some very old systems that are very critical, and they are built on technology that's not as friendly as newer systems on newer technologies.
And is it also a matter of the silo factor? I think that afflicts companies in all industries, but people sort of get in their lane and they stay in their lane and they know their lane really well, and they don't really look outside for opportunities to collaborate and enhance and things like that.
That is a factor, and that's why we believe sometimes these types of things need to be driven from the top. Mm-hmm. Some organizations try to make them happen organically, and sometimes that works, but most of the time you really need to have some top-down motivation in order to play nice in the sandbox, to get the silos broken down.
Right. So what areas represent the next frontier of digitally transforming how financial institutions work with their customers, attract their customers, engage their customers? What are you excited about?
Well, we're excited about 5G technology. And, a lot of people are talking about blockchain and cryptocurrency, and I think that's all great. But I think in terms of what you just mentioned, the ability to attract and retain customers, 5G offers a lot of promise, because just as 4G ushered in companies like Uber and Lyft, 5G is going to have profound effects on what you can do on your mobile phone. And that's because of the speed and the lack of latency, and the whole idea of this concept of augmented reality, where you can start to overlay in your app other data from other sources and do that in a real-time fashion, has a lot of potential. So think about, I'm walking down the street and I point my phone at a picture of a store. And if that store is a customer of a bank, then you can have some special offers. If I'm a customer of a bank and the store is a commercial customer of that same bank, you could have some special offers just appear on your phone, those types of things. Or I'm shopping for a car and I take a picture of the car, and the bank's auto loan rates pop up and information about that particular vehicle pop up. Those types of things are going to be much easier to implement now that 5G is starting to become widespread. Up to now, those have been sort of, I would call them laboratory experiments and very controlled, but now I think they'll be a lot more widespread. And so just as nobody really thought about what Uber would be in 2007, I think there's other things that we haven't even thought about yet that will become possible because of 5G.
Interesting. And I have to say, a lot of this, and I have to imagine, so for me personally, a lot of this sounds overwhelming. The amount of opportunity is very great, but also the amount of change that comes along with it. And so, maybe other people look at the opportunity with a little bit more excitement than I do. So not to project my impression of this, but what do you encounter when you're talking with financial institutions about their appetite for change? And then how do you sort of get people maybe over the reticence or the hump to start embracing these things?
I think a couple of years ago, there was a lot more uncertainty and doubt in our conversations with financial services firms. I think that's changed. I think there's the folks that I speak to are very excited about the changes that come up. Nobody seems to be overwhelmed. I think they all realize there's a lot to think about and some very critical decisions to make. But I think everyone on the whole is very excited. And so I don't see it that way. I see that the industry is very excited. The industry, like I said, has kind of passed a milestone and has gotten through the first phase of digital transformation and is really embracing what's coming up. And it's as I mentioned before, there's a lot of different experimentation going around. Some of it might work and some of it might not, and we'll just see what happens.
And maybe there's a greater appetite for trying and failing after this past year and change, and a lot of forced change maybe. And now people realize that if you bring in the wrong thing, it isn't the end of the world and you can shift maybe. I'm not sure.
And I think the realization is people are starting to realize that everything that we were saying 2 or 3 years ago, some of it has turned out to be true and some of it hasn't, right? People thought digital banks would take over everything. Well, there's a reasonable place for digital banks, but they haven't taken over everything. Some banks who started digital only banks have closed them down. So the market has a funny way of figuring out what the right balance of things are. And I think it's never totally one way or the other. And I think a lot of the financial institutions are seeing that and realizing that there's plenty of opportunity if they can figure out the right strategy.
And I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about more of the traditional marketing side of this whole brand differentiation conversation. But how important is it to communicate the investments that you're making in technology and digitization as a financial institution? I mean, obviously having the customer experience is really great for retention, and hopefully those folks go on and brag about how wonderful you are. But how are different financial institutions spreading the word about what they've added into their service offerings?
You mean from a marketing perspective?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think there's a lot of lessons financial institutions can learn from industries like retail, especially from a marketing point of view. Financial institutions that we've been exposed to are fairly traditional in how they do marketing. And again, there's a lot of reasons for that. One is obviously the regulations. You have to have a lot of consent when you market in the financial services industry. The other is that they've certainly invested in some very sophisticated tools, but perhaps haven't totally optimized the capabilities of those tools yet. And then there's other things that retail companies do now that financial institutions don't as a practice do. And I'm talking about things like abandoned cart follow-up, right? So if I go online and I'm trying to apply for a loan, very few, and I stop in the middle of it, very few banks have any campaigns around following up with me, asking me why I stopped. Was it because somebody interrupted me, like my kids were in the background and I had to stop, or was it, have I lost interest in the product or things like that? So those types of things that banks aren't regular, a lot of banks are not doing that as a normal practice. So those are the types of lessons learned I think banks can take from other industries just to come up to speed from a marketing perspective.
Interesting. And what has this all involved from a hiring perspective? How are financial institutions adding to their teams to be able to really go out and dominate in these areas? Or has the CIO of a financial institution gained in stature in recent years?
Oh, definitely. So we see a lot of interest now in what I would call the hot skill sets from a development and programming point of view, data science point of view, people who understand the technology as well as the business side of things, especially in the marketing area, people who understand how to use the data that's out there, whether it's from activity data from website visits or Google ad data, and how to use all that stuff together and bring it together in a way that makes a lot more optimized type of customer engagement. So we see a lot of interest and a lot of hiring of those types of skill sets into the financial services industry.
Interesting. And is there any, and I don't know how much you want to name names, but are there some financial institutions that are just really crushing their brand differentiation and really crushing sort of, adding in digital products that are enhancing their customer experience and all of that stuff?
Well, I'm not gonna say any names because then people who I don't mention might be upset.
Which is fair.
I think an interesting one is, and I'm not saying this because they're crushing it necessarily, because I have absolutely no idea how successful they've been. But to me, it's a very interesting concept. Is this bank called Bella Bank, and they are totally AI conversation driven. And it is an interface that is unlike any other banking app. And I think I was going to say go look at it, but wait till after the session today. But go Google Bella Bank and take a look at what they're doing, because not that that's going to be the future of banking, but I think that there are elements of that will be the future of banking and the future of financial services.
Oh, that's fascinating. So I have my homework. Well, Scott, what haven't I asked you that I should have, or what's a great sort of piece that we can leave folks with as they're wrapping up their day today?
Well, I think what I would like to kind of leave everybody with is that banks and financial institutions are very, very interested in competing in this new environment. And there are lots of folks who feel that they need to establish the right partnerships with the right types of, fintech companies as well as other banks in order to compete and survive in the environment going forward. So there's a lot of interest in these types of solutions, and there's a lot of interest in being able to implement these types of solutions quickly and to see rapid return on investment for them. So it's a little bit different than it was a few years ago. A few years ago, we were still climbing out of some regulatory problems, and there was a lot of money being funneled into regulatory compliance type of work. But the grow the bank budgets have totally shifted in the last few years, and so it's a very interesting, dynamic place to be right now.
It sounds fascinating. So thank you so much for sharing all of this today, and thank you to everybody who tuned in for our session. Really, very much appreciated, and hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Great. Well, thank you, Mary. I appreciate it. Thank you, everyone, for listening.